ON Radio, ON Worldwide, in Woonsocket.
Good afternoon. My name is Paul Vanas, and welcome to Real Estate Pro Talk. This show is a real estate-oriented program which will cover a variety of topics every Friday afternoon from 3 to 4 p.m. here on WOON Radio. Some of the topics we'll be talking about during our time together will be how to buy and sell a home, how to choose a mortgage broker, creative financing, staging a home, home inspections, and a whole lot more. I've been in the real estate business coming up on 40 years now, of which I own a real estate brokerage company, a real estate school, and a land development company. All of the knowledge that we're going to try to impart on you today is based on the continuing education classes that we teach licensed real estate brokers and agents, along with my personal experience and those of our expert guests. The goal in doing this is so you'll have the information in hand when you meet a seasoned real estate professional. You're welcome to call us today at 766-1240 and ask any question on the subjects we'll be discussing, or you can call me on my personal cell phone after the show at 401-265-6144. And of course, if you missed the show, certainly we have the YouTube broadcast that's uploaded every week. All you have to do is go over to youtube.com, put Real Estate Pro Talk in the search box, and you'll be able to hear the last show. And of course, this show is usually uploaded on Sunday. And of course, it's rebroadcast tomorrow, Saturday at 9 a.m. Our guest consultant today is Jeanne Elson Gordon of Keller Williams Leading Edge. Welcome back, Jeanne.
Hello there. How are you?
I'm doing well. 2 weeks in a row. I got you out in the COVID situation. Got you out of the, you're supposed to get you something to do, right?
There's so much going on in real estate right now. It is as busy as I've ever seen it.
That's amazing.
Not as busy selling, as busy as keeping things together and learning the new stuff coming out.
Yeah. I think this is going to open up a whole new way of doing business for us all in the future. That pain of change. Everybody has to leap into something new when they don't want to do it because they're used to doing the same old, and then all of a sudden something changes. And I remember years ago, my grandfather actually was telling me about when they wanted to bring poles down the road to put telephones in. And people in the city in Providence were complaining about the poles. They didn't want to see the poles because, they didn't have a did I say television or telephone? Telephone. And they didn't want to have a telephone, and they didn't care to have a telephone. And then all of a sudden, time marched on, and the poles were there, and the television, street lights, and everything else. I guess that's progress. But, Jeanne, today, before we get into it, you were out today, right? You had an inspection this morning?
I did.
How did you pull that off with all the social distancing?
Well, it was interesting. The inspector went in with his N95 mask on, and the buyers went in. I opened the door and explained to the inspector that I'd be sitting in my car because we're not allowed to have too many people in. And the other agent also sat in her car. And we texted back and forth and communicated. She got out of the car and talked to me through the window, and it's very different. I'm not sure I like that. I'm not sure I want that to continue. But at the end, we all stood 6 feet apart in a big circle in the front yard and described what they found. So It was very different.
Now, how did the inspector handle it? Did the inspector, the home? It was obviously a home inspection. It's a single-family house you sold, correct? Mm-hmm. How did the inspector handle it? Did he? He's doing this for a living now, so past couple of weeks he must be trained in the new format as well, right?
Yeah, he had his mask on and gloves on, and it's a different world. I went through afterwards and wiped down the doorknobs and the kitchen cabinets and anything I thought they could have touched. So, I don't know. It's different.
Yeah. So how did that work? Did everybody just stay outside and let the inspector go in on his own? And
the buyers were in with him.
Okay, I see.
Yeah, they were the only ones in there because otherwise there would have been 6 of us. And we're supposed to be 5, and that's it. And it was a small house, like you've said before. It's almost impossible to stay 6 feet apart in a relatively small house. So So I got to spend time in my car doing emails and checking things like that, which normally is a home inspection is a waste of time. We follow around and we listen. That's it, you know. But I was productive, and then I found out at the end. So that might be a good thing. Have you done an inspection in this new?
I haven't. I've been fortunate because the only properties I've sold are new construction. So, typically most buyers don't have a new construction or a newly constructed home inspected because the town inspects them, as you know, to issue the certificate of occupancy. So the one house I sold last week, I basically, again, opened the door, said, go in there, have fun, guys, knock yourself out, lock the door on the way out, and I received an offer via email, a few hours later. But, well, let me back up. Now, your inspection today, did everything turn out okay?
I think so. It seemed to be a very good inspection. There were a couple of things I think they'll ask for. But all in all, I think it was a very good inspection. So,
was it a house with sewer and water, or was it like a well and septic?
Yes, sewer and water.
I see.
Except,
That's good.
I was only there for 2 hours, so I would have been there much longer had it been septic and well. So, did that one a few weeks ago. So
really, it takes time. It's just some of those inspections take 3-4 hours sometimes, right?
They do, and I always feel that I need to be there to hear what's being said for my client's sake. Whether I'm with the buyers or with the seller, I still feel I need to hear. So that was alien to me to not be right there listening as the inspector was talking.
I see.
I don't know about you, but that's what I like to do.
Yeah, I mean, because you understand so much more when you hear it right from the inspector's mouth instead of trying to read the report later and then calling the inspector back for a clarification, because sometimes they use kind of boilerplate reports and with disclaimers that are just boilerplate. And of course, as you know, sometimes something sounds a lot worse than it really is, and other times it's a lot worse than it really is. So it's easier to just be there and understand. So I agree with you the way you do it.
Yeah.
But today, I wanted to talk about last week. We had a very interesting caller who called in and asked some questions about the seller's disclosure, which is a mandatory requirement for everyone selling a residential property in Rhode Island. And I started thinking about it this afternoon, Jeannie. Again, I worry about dessert 5 minutes before dessert. As you know, I called you about an hour ago. I said, hey, let's do your purchase and sales agreement class, because I think, if we go over a common sales agreement with the audience, they'll know what to look for and have questions about. And of course, anyone who wants to call, feel free, 766-1240. We answer any questions you have. But, I'm looking at the generic Rhode Island purchase and sales agreement, and there's like 28 paragraphs on this thing. Now, I know from the law of contracts class that I teach, there's only 5 elements to a contract to make it a binding contract in real estate: the names, the price, what's being sold, the date, and the affirmation, the signatures, which make it a valid contract. But all this other stuff on here is really, been added, I guess, over the years as problems arose. The Realtors Organization has added clauses to the sales agreement, and just starting off at the first one, I'm looking at the closing date. And a lot of folks don't know this, but the closing date is technically supposed to be at the Registry of Deeds, right?
We don't have one. In Rhode Island, we don't have a Registry of Deeds. I've always wondered why that was there.
Yeah, it's basically, and what I was taught years ago is that you have to have for a breach to occur, someone has to not show up, and because we don't know when the sales agreement is signed, because we don't know what lawyer's office is going to be used to close the sales agreement, they needed something there, just as a generic boilerplate. But I've only had one closing in 40 years that actually took place at the Registry of Deeds. They've all been either at a law office, and then the lawyers go out and record the sales agreement. How about you?
In Rhode Island, you had one at the registry? Or
Uh,
not?
we had it at the town hall. We had it in the back room at the town hall, only because the attorney, it was again once in 40 years. The attorney was I think it was a Westerly attorney, and he didn't have an office up here in Northern Rhode Island. So he said, "Hey, look, let's go meet at the Smithfield Town Hall. They have a little room in the back. We'll sign the papers. I'll record right there, give everybody their copies, and go." Have you ever had anything like that?
I never in Rhode Island have I had that. I have done it in Massachusetts because that's how it's done in Massachusetts, but I have not in Rhode Island. I've always had it at a lawyer's office, and it also says it will be at 10 a.m. Every closing cannot be at 10 a.m.
Right.
But I've had clients argue with me when I've said we're closing at 2 on Friday, and they go, no, 10 o'clock, that's what it says. And they really believe that 10 a.m. So now I say it'll be sometime during that day. It won't be at 10 because we can't close everything at 10.
Right.
So there's a little things on here that are quirky, and that's one of them. So.
Yeah, and it's funny you mentioned the 10 a.m. and a lot of folks don't realize that we learn it in when way back when in pre-license that there's a clause called time is of the essence.
Yes.
And time is of the essence. Whenever time is of the essence is applied to a performance date, a closing date, that means the closing has to happen on that day and time. And if not, the borrower or the seller. Well, let me pick the borrower first. The borrower can lose their deposit, or the seller can be in breach of contract and allow themselves to be open for a specific performance lawsuit. But our agreements, very rarely do we ever put time is of the essence, because that's really not a carved in stone date. Even though it says 10 a.m. on that date, it's, I guess the courts have kind of said it's a reasonable time. And I guess reasonable is a debatable point, and lawyers want it that way. They want words to be kind of generic, so a judge can kind of figure out what's reasonable. Is 2 days late reasonable? Is 1 week late reasonable? Is a month late reasonable? So I think for those of you who have signed a contract, don't rely on that closing date as a boilerplate, because especially now, right, with this COVID situation.
Especially now, because we don't know what's going on. Things are changing daily. We got a COVID addendum about a month ago, and now today we got a new one. So they keep changing the COVID-19 because COVID-19 keeps changing. So, and that form pretty much says that dates will be extended if there is a problem with either the mortgage or the closing date and time because of the COVID situation. I talked to a loan officer yesterday who said that he's had a situation with that where one of his buyers came down with COVID-19 and is in quarantine. So person can't go to the closing, so they had to extend it by the amount of the quarantine. So life is very different now.
Yeah, so that addendum that you just mentioned it's made part of the sales agreement.
Yes.
And it basically says up front to everyone, look, because we're in this situation, some of the dates and the performance dates and who was supposed to do what when can be reasonably extended because of COVID, right?
Exactly. And it also says that if the buyer loses their job because of this situation, they can receive their deposit back, which is very odd to have that in the purchase and sales. But we have how many people out of work right now because of this?
Right, and that opens up a whole can of worms, because I know from a mortgage standpoint, obviously you need a job to get a mortgage, and the mortgage companies or banks will deny the mortgage if someone loses their job. But boy, let's say it's a cash sale. Let's say it's cash,
right.
and someone lost their job, and all of a sudden they have really a get out of jail free card. To get their deposit come back, which they normally wouldn't have during normal times, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And in a lot of cases, the unemployment the people are receiving is equal to or greater with the new $600 in addition to, but they don't have a job, so the mortgage companies can't really, even if their employer says they're coming back, we don't know at what date they're coming back.
Hmm. Well,
So,
yeah, and you had mentioned the buyer and or the seller, but boy, when you think about it, the people that are involved in our transactions, you have the inspectors, you have the appraisers that have to come in for the banks, and then of course you got the buyers and sellers themselves. And although we don't play a major role once the documents are signed and the inspections are over, but you probably got a half a dozen people anyway involved in every single transaction that may be subject to this virus, right?
yes. And you and I, as realtors, used to go to closings, and now we've been tossed aside. We don't count anymore. I don't know if you've been told that, but my attorneys called me up and said, don't take this the wrong way, but you are not coming to any more closings. You don't count. And I said, oh, all right. I mean, I'm not needed there, but it's always been a nice place to go. And if there's any issues, we're there to straighten them out. And without being able to go to the closing, we can't straighten out any problems. So, but yeah, we're not needed anymore. Once we're done with our work,
Yeah.
the final glory goes to the closing attorney.
We're secondary citizens,
Yes,
but
we are.
yeah, but in other states they operate like that. Like I remember a friend of mine who you know as well, and I learned a lot from him when he got into the real estate business. He said, Paul, he goes, I can't believe the work that you guys do in this business, because he worked for IBM. And he was a salesman for IBM, and he would go in and sell corporations these big computers, like the kind you see on TV with the little wheels going around and everything. Yeah. And this was back in the 60s and 70s. He said, but as soon as I sold the computer, I handed it off to the finance department, and they handed it off to the installation department, and they handed it off to troubleshooting, and they handed it off to training. He goes, I never saw those folks again, other than a call once a year. How are you doing? Hope everything's working out. Do you need any accessories, and so on and so forth. But we tend to be just the opposite. We're in everything. We're in that mortgage application. We're at their inspection. We're all the way to the end.
Fire department to come to do the smoke certs. Yeah, we're in everything. We're there we arrange with the loan officer for the commitment to be on time. We just can't keep our hands out of this transaction, that's all. They're very involved. I know in other states that doesn't happen because, that my granddaughter just sold her house in Texas. There was nothing that realtor did. She listed the house, she did the purchase and sales, and she was done. She sent it on to the title company. So, we really, the way we do real estate in New England, I always like to say it's the 13 original colonies, because we sort of took on Old English law and Old English process, and we never let go of it.
Right.
The rest of the country let go of it.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, because I had a relative who was down in Virginia, and they had a closing, and they stayed in their motel room. And the someone from the title company, it wasn't even an attorney, it was kind of like a runner for the title company, showed up at their motel room, had them sign, a boatload of papers, and she left. She said, I'll be back in about an hour. And then she left, and then she came back an hour later with the keys. Yep. And said, here you go, here's your house. And they never left their motel room. Yep. This person was telling me he was watching a movie on HBO, and he wasn't even interrupted while in his movie, because that's how we bought a house.
Yeah.
It's just so unlike everything that we do up here.
Yes. And we do the walkthrough the day of the closing, and then we go to the closing, and sometimes we take them out to lunch, and, it makes for a long day. Yeah,
it does.
So,
it does.
But that's one of the quirky things on the purchase and sales. And I always say to people, everybody can't close at 10. You might close at 10, but there's 8 other hours in there that you might close too.
Sure.
So, and then the mortgage contingency is very important. It says how much of a mortgage they're applying for, and it should say what the interest rate is. Very often now they say prevailing, because they're all over the place.
Right.
But I know you don't like prevailing, and I don't like prevailing because it could be anything. But and it says how many years the mortgage is for and how much if there are points. And believe it or not, I'm hearing about mortgages now that have points. We haven't had points in so long, but I'm hearing about mortgages that do have points because of the situation we're in. So, but it's important that those things be adhered to because that is one of the important parts of the purchase and sales. It says when the listing agent and the seller is going to get the commitment letter that says that the buyer can actually buy. And if you miss that, you're in trouble.
So so for our listeners' sake, points are a percentage of the mortgage. So if they say it's 3.5 with 1 point, that means that 1 point is 1% of the mortgage amount that's paid at time of closing, right?
Yes.
I see. And you're seeing more of these?
Yeah, the loan officers I've been talking to are saying that, don't be surprised if the points start to come back. So I think it's to do with the COVID situation because they don't know and they don't know and they don't know. They don't know if it's going to close. They don't know if people are going to still have a job. They don't know a lot of things. So, and the interest rates, they're trying to keep them low. I mean, they skyrocketed when this thing first happened, and now they're back down again. But they went up from 3s up to 5. And now they're down to, I got somebody that's locking in at 3.35.
Wow, really?
That's a good rate.
Boy, that's a real good rate.
Yeah. But their original, they had let a rate lock go. Their original had been 3.99. That was just 60 days ago. So you can see the rates have come down. That's quite a drop.
It is. So that mortgage contingency basically says then, and obviously we're not going to go over every clause in the mortgage contingency, but it basically says if the buyer can't get the mortgage, they're released from the sale, right?
Yes, they need a denial, and with the denial letter, they're released from the mortgage and they get their deposit back.
So the deposit is returned, and I agree with you on that. The spot on the mortgage contingency. Some people like to leave that blank or say prevailing rate. The people who write prevailing rate weren't around in 1981. I can tell you when the rate was going up 0.5% every month, and what we always did is we would put a little fluff in there. Let's say the mortgage back then, obviously, but to apply it to today, if let's say the mortgage rate, the average mortgage rate is 3 3/4, we put 4 in there.
Yeah.
With a point, but to just put prevailing in there, that means there's no rate that protects the buyer, and if their rate goes up to the point where they get denied, or it's past if they don't lock in the rate at time of application, they can lose their deposit. So that rate, adding that rate to the sales agreement is very, very important.
Yes, and I don't like to sign any. I don't like to let my buyers sign any purchase and sales that says prevailing, just because when this COVID-19 started happening, rates went from low 3s to 5 overnight. If somebody could afford 5 but didn't want to pay 5 and it said prevailing, they would have to pay 5.
All right.
That makes a big difference in your mortgage payment.
Yeah, that's dangerous too. Now, the deposit is usually held by the selling company, correct?
Yes, the listing company. Mm-hmm. Yes, and it's in their escrow account, so it's totally protected. It doesn't come out of their escrow account unless it's returned or when it goes to closing. It is part of the purchase price.
I see. Now, do you ever get any sellers that say, I want to hold the deposit, or I know builders are typically notorious for that.
Yeah, contractors will ask for it. And then they're not covered by the real estate laws to do with escrow holds. So you have to make sure your client knows that. And with new construction, I always go, if something happens, you're not going to get it back. It's going to be in your kitchen. It's going to be part of your kitchen cabinets. So that needs to be very carefully explained, I think.
I agree. What about fixtures, Jeanne? Now, I know there's always some confusion about fixtures in a house, and I go back, and people are probably tired of hearing my stories, but I remember I had a buyer years ago who refused to close because the day that we walked through the property, about an hour before the closing, the seller had taken the wicker switch plates off and replaced them with those cheap plastic switch plates, and this buyer said, you know what, those were attached. And I bought the house in part because those wicker switch plates were there, and she didn't want to close. She actually, the seller had to go through their truck. They had everything packed up, and actually bring those switch plates to the closing. Tell us a little bit about fixtures.
In a way, she was right, because anything that is attached needs to stay. And that includes shrubs. You can't take up your shrubs and take them with you. I had somebody do that one time. They purposely waited until we should have been at the closing, and then they went and started digging up their shrubs because they were emotionally attached to them. But it should be anything that's attached. Your blinds, your outside, your flagpole, that kind of thing. And window treatments, in a lot of cases, they're considered, because they're part of the fixtures. Chandeliers, if you're going to take your chandelier with you, do it, take it down before you put the house on the market, because that's a fixture. The same thing with light fixtures, anything that's attached. If your bookcases are attached, the buyer can assume they go with the house. You might not intend that. If you don't intend it, there is a part on the purchase and sales that says exclusions, and they should be excluded. But I will tell you, once the buyer sees that stuff, they want it, because it makes the house. So, does all of that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And, it's the exclusion. So the seller then has the right to, in the negotiations, to say, hey, look, okay, I'm asking this much for the house. You offered me this much for the house. I'll tell you what, I'll take your offer, but I want to take my mother's azalea bush in the backyard, and I'll put a cheap, whatever. I'll go to Home Depot and replace it, or the chandelier, or the ceiling fan, or whatever, right?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It can be part of the negotiations.
Yeah, and lately we've been asked to put in the clause where we include appliances and things like that, that they have no monetary value and they're being left as a convenience to both parties. So the appraisers have asked that we do that, because in some cases they were being asked to find a value for the appliances and then depreciate them. And who wants to depreciate a 10-year-old washer?
Right.
So they just asked if we would just put in there that they have no monetary value. They're being left as a convenience. And so don't be surprised if you're a buyer or a seller and you see that there, because they do have value. We all know they have value.
Right.
But for appraisal purposes, they don't want them included in the mortgage value.
That makes perfect sense. Wow, boy, a half hour has gone by, believe it or not. So let's do this. Let's take our first commercial break, and we'll be right back to Real Estate Pro Talk.
Real Estate Pro Talk is a live radio talk show dedicated to educating its listeners on the entire spectrum of real estate matters. Part of the American dream is owning a home or investment property, or perhaps even becoming a real estate agent yourself. Paul Vanas and his team of real estate professionals have over 250 combined years of experience in the industry. In other words, we can make it happen for you. Why go down the road less traveled when we can put you directly on the real estate superhighway? Whether buying or selling in today's complicated real estate market, or if you just need advice about jumping into the real estate business for a career change, you'll need a decisive edge based on experience. Call Paul Vanas at 401-265-6144 for a free, no-obligation consultation. That's Paul Vanas at 401-265-6144.
And we are back to Real Estate Pro Talk with Jeanne Elson Gordon of Keller Williams Leading Edge Realty in Lincoln. We're just going over some of the highlights of the sales agreement that most people use when they purchase a residential property, the residential being anything from 1 family to 4 family. And, of course, you're welcome to call us at 766-1240 if you have any questions, concerns, or if you just want to talk. Tell us what you're doing during this COVID situation, how you're handling the quarantine, or I call it the lockdown. Jeannie, the audience can't see me, but, I usually have short hair. And by the time this is over, I remember Professor Irwin Corey way back when in the 60s, and I don't know how many people can remember that. I'm going to have this wild hairdo because when I go to the barbershops and the hairdressers and everything else, right?
You can join the rest of the world and post your before and after you do your own, have your wife cut your hair. So somebody posted that the person had slipped in the back and they shaved a whole strip up the back of his head. He said it should be done. It should be back by June.
Oh, gee, they got a reverse mohawk right up the back of their head, right?
So, it's challenging.
Getting back to the sales agreement, what about, explain to the audience the adjustments that are made to the typical transaction at the closing, because this confuses, I find, especially the sellers, because they don't understand taxes, property taxes. Tell us about the adjustments that are usually made at the closing for taxes and water and fuel and all that other good stuff.
Well, the water is easy because we take a final water reading if they're town water, and then whatever town it is gives us a water bill. So the seller pays water up to the day they leave. Taxes are not so easy, because the seller pays taxes up until the day they sell the house. However, in Rhode Island, taxes are paid in arrears. So while you get your first tax bill in July, that July bill is paying for January, February, and March. So pretty much every seller will owe at least 6 months' worth of taxes when they sell. And they are up to date with their taxes, and they will argue with you, no, my taxes are current, I paid them all. And yes, they are current, but we pay in arrears. So what we pay in July is for the first 3 months of the year, and the next payment is for the next 3 months. So taxes can be an expensive item for the sellers, and they need to realize that when they're figuring their proceeds. So, and then the buyer takes up the taxes on the day they move in. Does that make sense?
From that day forward, yeah. And what about, so sewer works the same as water?
Sewer works the same way. We get a sewer reading, and they pay, based on the water usage, they pay their sewer bill. However, if there's an assessment, either the buyer can assume the rest of the assessment, or the seller can pay it off. In some cases, it depends what type of mortgage they get, how that happens, or it's negotiated. There's still a lot of towns that people still do have a sewer assessment. I know I have one in North Smithfield. It's going down every year, but I still have one. So where I sell the house, I would have to either pay it off, or the buyer would have to assume it.
So that's when the municipality says, okay, if you want to tie into the sewers, it costs the town X amount of dollars to tie in per person. So each property would have a dollar figure, and per year, right? You'd have to pay this assessment per year. Is it one lump sum, or is it broken up?
Well, they're quarterly, like the taxes, in my case.
Okay.
And I started out with a $19,000 bill, and I think I'm down to 12 now. So, I mean, it does diminish, and the interest rate is very low. But like Warwick is just installing sewers, so some of Warwick has an assessment. And there's quite a few towns that would have an assessment. So you need to figure that out, too, when you're figuring the seller's proceeds and the buyer's expenses, depending on which side you're on.
Yeah, that's tough to do, because back in the old days, I used to meet with the sellers the night before the closing at their house. It's usually the last night in the house, whatever. And I'd bring a legal pad and go over some of the expenses they were going to incur and try to come up with at least as close a number as possible that they'd be walking away with the day of the closing, the following day. And of course, there's a lot of mystery there because you have to base that on what they told you their mortgage was, and sometimes it wasn't exactly accurate.
Or they got a second mortgage.
Or if they didn't make a payment that month, which is actually for the previous month, which everyone doesn't really realize that, like, your payment due on the first of the month is not for the coming month, unlike rent. That's for the last month. So they figure, well, I'm closing on the 10th. I'm not going to pay my mortgage this month. And then at the closing, their proceeds are off by 1 1/3 mortgage payments if you close on the 10th. And they don't really grasp that. Now, not everyone anyway. What about fuel adjustments and stuff? I mean,
Gas is easy because you get a final reading and the seller pays the gas bill. Same thing with electric heat. But with oil, we should take an oil reading, and we should get the company to give us a statement, and we should have the previous delivery tag so that we know how much they paid per gallon. And the buyer, it says on the purchase and sales that the buyer will reimburse the seller for any oil left in the tank. And sometimes that's a pricey item. If it's $500, then a lot of first-time home buyers don't have an extra $500. So that gets a little dicey, too, if they've just filled the tank. So,
yeah, especially like a couple of years ago when it was like $4 a gallon. And, if you got a full tank, it's a 275-gallon tank. That's $1,000 plus.
Right.
That the buyer might not be expecting to pay at the closing, which is like I explained to you a few weeks ago on the show, that my first closing, the folks gave me the oil in the tank, and I thought that was the way to go. and then I was educated to say, no, the seller is due that money back at the closing. Same thing with propane. If there's propane, right? Same rule applies.
You get a reading, and then you pay how much they paid per gallon. Now, that is on the listing agent or the seller to remember. And if the listing agent doesn't remember it, it is a gift to the buyer, because it isn't up to the buyer's agent to say, charge my buyers more money. So, okay. And I've had a couple of times where the listing agent just totally forgot. Just didn't do it, And my attorney, the closing attorney, would call me and go, we don't have an oil adjustment here. And it's like, well, I can tell you what's in there, but don't charge my client unless you get something from the sellers, because, I don't know what they paid per gallon and that kind of stuff. So it is up to your agent to do that. So sellers should remember, I've got oil in the tank and I should get reimbursed for that, because it is pricey right now.
Yeah. I noticed, too, the sellers also forget after the closing, it's, at least in my experience, probably in yours, too, about their insurance, that they've prepaid. Prepaid insurance is an asset, and if they've already paid for the whole year's worth of insurance, or depending on where their anniversary date is, they'll have money coming back to them from their insurance company, right?
Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You can't cancel the policy.
Yep. And that should be an automatic that we tell them about, but sometimes it isn't. Anything else they've prepaid too. And with condos, if there's an assessment on the property, the buyer may have to assume that assessment too. So it's important when they're buying a condo to know if there is an assessment now or coming. Because I had one condo that the assessment was going to be $5,000 each year for 3 years. Now that's a big ticket for a buyer to take on. That's $100 a week for 3 years. It was going to be a great improvement. They were putting roads in, but it was still a huge assessment.
And that's why those condos, well, I'm glad you mentioned condos, Jeannie, because I wasn't even going to mention it, but that's usually on the sales agreement, right? The buyer has a period of time to review the documents?
Yes. They have 10 days to review the condo docs and the budget and the profit and loss statement and all of that. And they need to sign off that they have read them. And if they don't get them until 5 days before the closing, they can say no, because they didn't have 10 days to review them. had it happen. That's why I know that.
Yeah, me too. I had it happen at the closing table.
Uh-huh.
I don't
It's
know if yours
amazing
was.
how we learn.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and that's where that's where if especially if you're a first-time home buyer of a condo, you should really have someone who's astute with numbers look at that financial statement, because I find condo people like to keep the monthly payment as low as possible, and they fight you at the meetings. You want to propose something that, hey, I think we should increase our dues $10 a month, because when we go to replace this road 10 years from now, we want to keep up with the cost of replacing roads, and then all of a sudden everyone votes against it. You're the bad guy at the meeting, and then 10 years comes, and then the road needs to be done, and now they don't have the money to do the road, so that's where the assessments kick in, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Sometimes it's difficult because they don't have the money, and sometimes it's not a road. A road you can delay a year, but my mom's condo, they had a major storm that took off the roof, not took them off, but destroyed the roofs of 5 buildings, and they weren't ready to do 5 roofs, and that was going to be a very, very big assessment until somebody got a loan, and it was only $200 a month for 3 years, which still was pricey, but not a lot better than the huge assessment to do it in one payment.
Right. Yeah, you should always have someone, if I were ever to move in a condo, I'd want to make sure that whoever was the treasurer, was keeping tabs on what roofs cost every year, and what does a road cost every year, and what does it cost to replace this or replace that, instead of using the 1989 budget
Exactly.
numbers, and then all of a sudden there's no surprises later on. So that buyer has 10 days to review all those documents, and if they don't like what they see, they're out, right? They're out,
and they get their deposit back.
Very good. Very good.
So it's important that you set up time with an accountant or something like that to get those reviewed, because the average person wouldn't know what was needed for repairs and what the reserves should be.
I see. What about the seller's obligations now? I notice on our new agreements that the sellers have to do some things like smoke detectors and things like that. Can you tell our audience a little bit about that?
It's a seller obligation to have the fire department come and test the smoke and carbon monoxide detectors, and they get a certificate, and they are $30, and it is a seller responsibility to install them properly and have the certificate. Now, I always make sure that I get the certificate. The seller can do it. They can be there when the fire department comes, and they can get the certificate, but I usually stop by and pick it up, because I've had them packed and on the way to California, and you can't close. The mortgage company will not close without an original copy of the smoke cert in the file. So it's a $30 and a 10-minute appointment, but it is an important part of the closing.
Now, how are they handling that right now with this situation? Is business as usual? Do you know? Or?
It depends on the town. Some allow us to take pictures of the smoke certs and the carbon monoxide detectors up, and some are waiving them. Some are still doing them. It depends on the town. We've got 39 towns, and they're all operating 39 different ways. So we have to call and see which way they're doing it today. And the notices we got last week might be different this week, because they're all changing. Right now, I think it's only 2 town halls that are open, because the town halls are also closing. I think yesterday, when I got the most up to date, there were only 2 towns that were open, and I think most of the fire departments are skeleton. Quite a few will take the pictures. So, but Rhode Island Housing mortgages, they need a physical smoke cert from the fire department, so you've got to make arrangements for that.
I see. Well,
It's not easy these days.
Yeah, everybody's shifting over, and it's quite dynamic. Well, let's see. Let's do this because I want to go over, or have you go over, Jeannie, when we come back from the commercial break, the actual home inspection contingency that's on most sales agreements, and that's really important. That's why I wanted to save it for last. So let's take our last commercial break, and we'll be right back.
Real Estate Pro Talk is a live radio talk show dedicated to educating its listeners on the entire spectrum of real estate matters. Part of the American dream is owning a home or investment property, or perhaps even becoming a real estate agent yourself. Paul Vanas and his team of real estate professionals have over 250 combined years of experience in the industry. In other words, we can make it happen for you. Why go down the road less traveled when we can put you directly on the real estate superhighway? Whether buying or selling in today's complicated real estate market, or if you just need advice about jumping into the real estate business for a career change, you'll need a decisive edge based on experience. Call Paul Vanas at 401-265-6144 for a free, no-obligation consultation. That's Paul Vanas at 401-265-6144. And
welcome back to Real Estate Pro Talk. And, of course, a big thank you to Dave Richards, who's the man behind the curtain over there at the radio station, making sure all the buttons are pushed, and both Jeannie and I are coming in remotely over the internet into the station, and Dave is working his magic to make sure that everybody hears this broadcast. So we thank you. We're quite appreciative. And Jeannie, last week we ran out of time. I was on a tear. I don't remember why, but I was on a tear. I'm usually on a tear. I forgot to have you give the audience your contact information. So why don't you do that now before I get on a tear again, and then it goes past the hour.
Okay. My cell phone is 401-935-2515. And my email is jelsonrlty@gmail.com. And that's it. They can catch me.
So
okay.
935-2515.
That's it.
That's 401.
That's the best way to get me.
And you're licensed in both states, right? You're licensed in Mass and Rhode Island.
Yeah.
Beautiful. That's great.
And I've been licensed for 30 years. So
that's all?
Been around. Yeah. That's why I can say it happened. It happened.
Yeah.
We learned by having it happen to us.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So let's talk about this inspection contingency. Every sales agreement, or at least the Rhode Island Association of Realtors sales agreement, Jeannie, has a period on the sales agreement whereby a buyer can have the property inspected. And if you remember the caller who called in last week, and when asked about the seller's disclosure, we talked about that, if the seller tries to disguise something, a good inspector is probably going to pick it up anyway. Tell us about that inspection contingency.
The inspection period is 10 business days, and the buyer has the right to have any inspection they want as long as they pay for it. And the buyer does want to pay for it. I've had people say, I want the seller to pay for it. Well, the inspector is working for the person who's paying him. So you do want the buyer to pay for the inspections. They can have lead, they can have radon, they can have physical, mechanical. If they're in the country, they can have well and septic. But they have 10 business days to do those. And the 10 business days is do the inspection, digest it, make your requests of the seller, and negotiate it. If you're not going to have the negotiations done in those 10 days, you need an extension. And there is a form that I like to use that is the buyer's request, and it used to say and/or termination, and it scared people. But that gave the seller notice that I'm not happy with the inspection, and I might want to back away, because you need the 10 days in order to use the inspection period to decline the purchase. Okay, and the 10 business days start the next day. If we were to sign a purchase and sales today, we'd start counting on Monday, because Saturdays, Sundays, and holidays do not count. So you really have 2 full weeks to get it done. Now, we're not extremely busy right now. The inspection I had today, the inspector said he's operating at 50%. So normally he does 30 in a week. He's only doing 18 this week. So, but in a busy period, you might have to wait 8 days to get an inspector in there. So that form that I mentioned, the buyer's request, as opposed to the repair addendum, the buyer's request is a negotiating tool. And with that, you can say, I'd like these things done, and the seller can counter. And the seller, you usually give the seller more time too, because the seller would want to get contractors in there to see if they really did need to do the work. And when you give them it depends what you're requesting, but I usually give an extra week. And then the seller can have contractors come in and decide yes or no. And you need to understand, not you know it. The buyers need to understand that if the inspector says there's an electrical problem and they have a licensed electrician come in, the licensed electrician will trump the inspector, because the inspector is more than likely not a licensed electrician. So with a report from a licensed contractor in that field, you may or may not get what you have asked for. Does that make sense?
It does. So the way it sets up, you sign the sales agreement. Of course, it sounds like the buyer is pretty busy in the front end of the transaction. They're having inspections. They're going for their mortgage applications. So they're pretty busy. But you have this inspection, and assuming if they find something in the house that's not to their liking, they go back to the seller and ask the seller to negotiate either money off or repair or cancel the sale, right?
Yeah, if it's really...
and this is all done without penalty, right? They get their deposit back if they cancel the sale. So then the seller at that point, the seller has the right to say, yes, I'll do it, or no, I won't do it, or, take it or leave it, right? Basically. So no one's twisting the seller's arms. Let's say it's, I don't know, let's say they found carpenter ants in the house, and no one's twisting the seller's arms saying you have to get this house treated for carpenter ants, right?
No, there's absolutely no obligation to do it, but if he wants to sell his house, he should cooperate. So, and then from that request form, you go to the repair addendum when everything is negotiated, and the buyer and the seller sign that, and that becomes part of the purchase and sales also.
I see. Now, do you have, in your experience, do you have many that the people just can't come to terms and they walk away from each other, or are pretty? How does that work?
Well, there's weeping and gnashing of teeth a lot of times, but somebody usually gives. So only, I think, just a few times. One of which was almost last weekend. Have we walked away and said no, either do it or we're going to walk. So. But those were major issues, and usually it's major issues that if they're not going to do them, then if they're not going to do the major issues, you wonder what else you didn't find yet. Right.
Yeah, and those issues are important, especially for first-time home buyers, because they don't have the money. Let's face it, they're scraping nickels and dimes together to buy this thing, and if that septic system is bad, or the roof is bad, or the boiler, furnace, whatever, it's one thing to have a leaky faucet and a creaky floor or something, but to have a major league item go the first year of home ownership for someone who barely scraped the money together to buy it is a very cumbersome fact.
And sometimes it's really hard, especially when they need to do well and water and septic, to convince a buyer that they really need to spend that money, because it's pricey. It can be $1,400 to do all the inspections. But the bottom line is, if they can't flush or if they can't drink the water, they don't have a livable home. Right. So they need to do those inspections.
Yeah, and of course, you've just gone over probably the biggest parts of the sales agreement. There are other other paragraphs in the sales agreement. They all tend to shrink in importance as we go down the line, which we're not going to have time today. But probably lastly, with about a minute or so left, Jeanne, additional provisions is just basically anything they want to throw in there, right?
Anything you want to throw in. That's where closing cost credit would go in if you're asking the seller to pay part of the closing costs, or if it's subject to If the seller said, I'm taking the lilac bush because my grandfather gave it to me when I moved in, then that's where that would go, subject to the seller removing carefully the lilac bush in the backyard. That's where any other additional provision would be. And a lot of times it will say subject to appraising at or above the purchase price.
Yeah. So washer, dryer, you're throwing in the boat in the backyard, the swimming pool, the fixtures, that's where that would go, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
Wow.
And you really should review it carefully with your agent and understand what you're signing, because it is a legal document and you are bound by it. Unless you can get out on a denial of a mortgage or an inspection issue, you are bound to buy the house.
Very good. Well, we're out of time. We thank you. Same channel next week.
That works for me.